Hello, this is Historical Fiction with Kwiatoslav, and this is part of an ongoing kind of collaboration I'm doing with my friend Derek Green, who also talks about historical fiction on his YouTube channel there. And we've been going through a number of my favorite um, historical fiction authors' short stories there, and we've been reading them together and producing our own videos, giving our opinions and evaluations of the stories there, which has been a really interesting and excellent exercise in kind of reading many of my favorite stories in kind of collaboration with someone else there to get further opinions, which has been really, I think, a really helpful exercise, particularly because Derek has selected as our next bit of Robert E. Howard material one of my absolute favorite collections of short stories by Robert E. Howard called The Lord of Samarkand, edited by Rusty Burke there, which is a collection of Robert E. Howard's Crusader tales set in and around the time of the Crusades, actual historical fiction with no magic or sorcery involved there. And I think this is Robert E. Howard's absolute best work. It's my favorite by far. I like Conan, I like Bran MacMorn, I like Solomon Kane, but this is my absolute favorite collection of work by Robert E. Howard. I mean, I am biased because I'm a historical fiction fan, but I think this is where he really reached his peak of kind of literary powers there, and this is a collection that should belong in the possession of any Robert E. Howard fan there. So I've made some previous videos about these. I'll try to link to the Robert E. Howard's tales overall, but in this one I'd like to kind of go a little bit deeper and try to analyze some of the stories, in particular discussing them as we've been reading it in concert with Harold Lamb's short stories. And when you read these two collections together, you can really see a great deal of influence, as Lamb was very influential on Robert E. Howard, his tales, and I think his writing style and so on, although they do have very kind of distinct writing styles there. One of the things that Derek mentioned in his videos before was he talked about kind of the language that Harold Lamb uses in his tales there, and it's very archaic and very literate there, but I can see how it might be slightly make the stories a bit less accessible if you don't know what Cathayans are and Tatars and things like that. It might make the stories a little bit less accessible. Robert E. Howard uses that language as well, but I think in a way his stories are slightly more accessible. They're not quite as they don't quite use quite as much obscure language as Harold Lamb's tales do. So I think in that way they're probably slightly more accessible than Lamb's tales there, which is interesting because the two come from extremely different backgrounds there. You know, they're both American, but Harold Lamb was, you know, kind of Ivy League educated, world traveler, went to Afghanistan, spoke multiple languages, was a diplomat, was a movie consultant and so on there, which was a very different background from Robert E. Howard, who spent, you know, the entirety of his young life in rural Texas, I think with just a few trips to Mexico and surrounding areas there, which is actually, you know, makes, I think, Robert E. Howard even more impressive, that he didn't have access to this Ivy League education, and he didn't have access to the resources that Harold Lamb. He only relied on his imagination for these tales written, you know, in the Far East in exotic lands that he would never travel to there. So I think in a way that makes Robert E. Howard's stories even more impressive there. So I'd like to kind of delve into these. First of all, in the story, it's got a really fantastic introduction by Patrice Launay, who's a Robert E. Howard scholar. He's got a great quote here from the beginning from Robert E. Howard: "There's no literary work to me half as zestful as rewriting history in the guise of fiction. I wish I was able to devote the rest of my life to that kind of work. I could write 100 years and there would still be stories clamoring to be written by the scores. Every page of history teems with dramas that should be put on paper." So you can see it was really Robert E. Howard's love. He talks about after he wrote Sowers of Thunder there, he writes about all of the different tales, Babar the Tiger, the rise of the Ottomans, the conquest of Constantinople by the what he calls the Fifth Crusade, what we now call the Fourth Crusade, subjugation of the Turks, and so on there. So he just absolutely loved history and was very. I love the way that he says rewriting fiction, history in the guise of fiction, which is a great description overall of historical fiction there. And you can see another great thing about this collection is they're made, the stories are done in publication order. Basically, you can see these are his early stories, and these are the stories that were published later in life. And then it's also got some of his unpublished completed stories here, as well as his unfinished stories and drafts and so on. So it's a really thorough collection of the stories there. And what I find really interesting is you can see his progression. I think the early stories are good, but not great. By the time he gets to the mid-range and the ending stories, I think those are some of his absolute best stories that he ever wrote there. So reading the stories in this order gives you a really nice sense of his progression as a historical fiction writer. The first story here is called Red Blades of Black Cathay, which was written with his friend Tevis Clyde Smith. I think Tevis actually did the research. He paid Tevis to do the research because, again, he was very limited in his time there and his access to research there. So he was not averse to paying his friends to do some research for him there, which is, I think, one of the main reasons that he didn't write a great deal of historical fiction, because he had to pay for the research and it did not pay particularly well compared to the more pulpy novels or the more pulpy magazines that he published in later. So, which is a pity, because he showed extremely excellent talent for writing historical fiction, which I think is a really challenging skill, because it's a bit like writing poetry in iambic pentameter. You've got these limitations on the writing there, but the interesting thing is when you're able to write a story within these limitations, it's actually even more impressive than, say, a fantasy with no historical limitations there. So that's one of the things that impresses me most about writers of historical fiction, when they get the history right there. And Robert E. Howard generally gets the history right. Sometimes he was limited by the access that he had at the time, but this first tale is called Red Blades of Black Cathay. A really great start to the collection there. It focuses on a Norman knight called Godric de Villehard, it's set in about the year, I'd say about 1206 or so there. So the story begins, he's taken a collection of knights from the kingdom of Oultremer, which is the kind of Christian kingdom of the east of Jerusalem there, and he set out to the east into Asia Minor and into Central Asia, searching for the legendary Christian king Prester John there. And the story begins with his entire force being wiped out, aside from himself there, by the inhabitants of, he goes through Byzantine, Trebizond, and these other historical areas, trying to reach kind of Cathay, which is where he believes that, which is China, which is where he believes that Prester John lives. And he does, as a spoiler, he does eventually reach the kingdom of Prester John, but it's much less, say, impressive than he might imagine. And the story, I said, it's really excellent because he basically becomes involved in the defense, because if you know 1206, that's right about the time when the Mongol hordes were beginning to invade the Central Asia there, and he becomes kind of a warrior, almost a medieval. He leads the local forces in kind of a medieval Thermopylae there, which is, I said, a really excellent tale. And this is one of the few tales, I'd say, with a happy ending. And another thing is, you can see the massive influence that Harold Lamb had on this tale. He has a summary a little bit later here of Harold Lamb's, I can't remember exactly what novel, The Wolf Chaser, which Robert E. Howard wrote. And if you've read The Wolf Chaser from Harold Lamb, you can see definite influence on this story. They're very similar. A Westerner who goes east and becomes involved in repelling Mongol hordes, in a kind of very, very last stand type of scenario there. So it's a really excellent start to the collection. The second story in the collection here, which has the fantastic name, the Hawks of Oultremer. Oultremer was the name that the Europeans gave to the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem at that time, and it concerns the only recurring character in this collection, Cormac Fitzgeoffrey, who was a Norman Irish knight in the time of Richard the Lionheart. In fact, Richard makes an appearance in a flashback in this story where he's Cormac actually saves the king there. And Cormac is very much I would say, prototypical Howard hero there. And when I say prototypical, a lot of people might think that means Conan, but I would actually argue that Conan was not a prototypical Howard hero, because if you look at his earlier heroes like Solomon Kane and Cull and Bran MacMorn, these guys are much more morose and much more doom and gloom than his later characters. They have a very very dour outlook on life and usually have little to no contact. They're very I would say almost they avoid the company of women there quite a bit there, and whereas Conan, in contrast, is basically a party animal. He's a live life to the fullest type there. But Fitzgeoffrey much resembles these kind of more stoic, grim. They call him grim Norman Crusader there on the road to Antioch there, and he basically he's the kind of guy who offends a lot of people. He winds up killing a Christian lord who betrayed him, and goes on this interesting adventure. I do have a few kind of minor historical gripes with this one. He's got some characters there who historically would not have been available, and he kind of uses the name Nureddin for the villain, which was the name of another Muslim leader who had died several years earlier, who's obviously not the same character here, but it's kind of unfortunate that he chose that name for this one, because Nureddin was Salah ad-Din's predecessor as the Atabeg of Mosul there. So I've got some little minor quips there, but as I said, it's a really nice introduction to the character. And this is a character that Robert E. Howard planned on writing a series of stories about. He wanted to take him into different lands and so on. But he only wrote 3 stories about Cormac Fitzgeoffrey there, I think because he realized that the true star of historical fiction was actually the time period rather than the characters. When you pick a single character, you're limited to a single time frame and a single area there. Whereas if you don't limit yourself to a single character, you've got the free reign of history to talk about. The third story in this collection is the Blood of Belshazzer, which is another Cormac story. This is where he's in exile and he travels into the Saracen lands. This is probably I would say my least favorite of the collection. It's just kind of a big meeting of one of the types of stories that Howard liked, but a big meeting of lots of undesirable characters fighting over a treasure there, and it's not particularly historical. So that's one of the gripes I've got against. Still a good readable story, but amongst these other fantastic stories, it doesn't quite measure up as well. The best Cormac story I actually find is one which was an incomplete story. You'll find in kind of the end of the book there, which is called The Slave Princess, which is a story that he never finished. He finished about 80% of it. And this is actually a really great story. He, Cormac is riding with, some Turkomans there, and he actually kidnaps this slave girl, and he finds that she resembles the kidnapped daughter of a local Arab lord there, and he hatches this plan to kind of sell her to the lord there, and brings the slave girl to a Christian friend of his, a Frankish friend, Amory there, and he goes off to negotiate the settlement there, but actually finds out that Amory actually falls in love with the girl as he's away. And when Cormac comes back to sell the slave girl princess there, he finds that he has to fight his friend, and you actually see basically Cormac kind of almost becoming the bad guy, where it feels like he's trying to fight with his friend. I said it's probably one of the few stories where there's a real kind of moral dilemma for Cormac there. So I would actually say I wish that story had been finished rather than Blood of Belshazzer there and published, because I think that was a really. But we do know basically the full story. He just didn't manage to finish it there for whatever reason. I'm not sure if it was, he had a very short life, passing away at the age of 30, so he left many unfinished stories. I think probably the final story that I'll have to talk about this time, because this video's going a bit longer than my usual videos there, is called The Sowers of Thunder, which is a tale which is set later on in the kingdom of Oultremer. They're set in about 1244, I'd say. To give a little bit of the history of the background, the kingdom of Oultremer, the kingdom of Jerusalem, was originally conquered in 1099 and occupied for about 80 years. But then Salah ad-Din retook Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, many of the lands, but the Christians still had a section of lands such as Acre and Tyre there on the coast, where they tried to reconquer the Holy Land, the Jerusalem in particular there, which is where Richard the Lionheart became famous for his attempts to reconquer and so on. But at one point, the Franks, the Christians, did actually retake Jerusalem. Frederick II actually negotiated to buy back Jerusalem and held it for a number of years. But unfortunately, for the Christians, he didn't buy any of the surrounding lands. So once the peace treaties evolved, then after 20 years, then Jerusalem was basically up for grabs again. And this story concerns basically the reconquest by the Turks of Jerusalem. And the main character in this one is an Irish knight called Red Cahal there, who's another kind of exiled character there, and he's traveling around, and you kind of learn the local politics and so on. And in the course of this story, he's constantly meeting this one kind of Arab character who appears in different guises, who's actually the leader of the Turks, called Baybars, an actual historical character there. And I don't think it's a big spoiler to say who it is, because it's fairly obvious throughout the story, the character that he's meeting. And it does seem, if you've ever read Walter Scott's Talisman, then you know, because he has Saladin do the same thing, where he's kind of disguising himself as different characters and walking among the populace. And that seems a really kind of almost ridiculous concept, but it actually is historically true that Baybars did actually disguise himself and go among his own people. Now, the Baybars in this tale is much more noble than the actual Baybars, who was a Mamluk. He was a slave who became the ruler of the Ottoman Turks and was, really bloodthirsty, not a nice character there. And I think when he went among his populace in disguise, it was mostly as kind of a secret police to try to look for dissidents there. But Robert E. Howard has Baybars disguise himself, even go amongst the Christians and so on, and become kind of a rival to Red Cahal, who is the main one. There's a slight twist at the end that I'm not. That didn't really work for me as well as some of the other twists, but overall it's a good tale. Robert E. Howard really liked to start choosing kind of his outlook there is kind of appropriate to the time period where the Christians were losing and being kind of forced out of the Holy Land there. So it's a very kind of morose tale there. But overall, I think it's a good one there. But I think it's a good setup for the next batch of tales, which I'll probably have to talk about in my next video, because I don't want to take up too much more time, where I think you really when you get to the core of this, you get to the really excellent tales in the story. So there's my first kind of opening review of Lord of Samarkand there, the Tales of Lord of Samarkand, and obviously a high recommendation for anyone interested in Robert E. Howard and historical fiction overall. And I'm very much looking forward to Derek's initial opinion. I think for him, most of these stories he's reading for the first time there. So I'm really looking forward to hearing his opinion and watching his video on the topic. So thanks for listening.